Hi, I am Jay and I work as a project manager for SMC. This is a short video prepared to help new employees. There are 4 critical topics for success in stakeholder management. To discuss these topics are my colleagues Mark, Lori, Claire, Deepak and Mohan. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jay. The definition within the Project Management Institute is very broad, and I could perceive that the list of stakeholders for my project could be vast. Where do I start, and how do I narrow this down? The first step is to brainstorm and use some expert judgment to identify the relevant stakeholders for my project. You should focus on stakeholders who have a legitimate interest in or expectation of the project. Some of the common stakeholders on a project would normally include the client, delivery team members, and the project sponsor. These are only a few examples, and if we consider a new motorway construction project, stakeholders could also include the road user, effective landowners, iwi, and even our competitors. All stakeholders should be captured and documented within a stakeholder register with an analysis carried out on each stakeholder. Like all projects, the environment constantly changes, and stakeholder perceptions are no different to change. Ongoing engagement with stakeholders is key to any project. Over to you, Lori.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, I'm Lori, and I'm going to talk about the next step: how to plan your stakeholder engagement. There's a bit to consider when planning stakeholder engagement, but first you'll want to take a critical look at the stakeholders you've identified. It's important to sort these stakeholders into groups so that you can plan out how you're going to engage with them, as they do hold a lot of power over your project. A well-planned stakeholder engagement can help set up your project to progress smoothly, while failing to do so can cause expensive and time-consuming roadblocks. To group your stakeholders and build the stakeholder analysis, you'll rank your stakeholders against both their level of interest and how much power they hold with respect to your project. Once you've done this, you'll find all the stakeholders fall within one of these 4 groups. Next, you're going to add that power and interest information from the stakeholder analysis to the stakeholder register. You'll then build on that by adding information about your stakeholders' project expectations and their communication requirements. Now, you're almost done planning, but it's important to note that the stakeholder register is a living document and should be updated throughout the life of the project. Over to you, Claire.
The next step is to engage your stakeholders. You will need to taper how you communicate for each stakeholder. The running of a managed isolation facility gives a good example of how much can ride on how you engage. For a MIF manager, stakeholder management was the main role. Stakeholders ranged from the New Zealand Government to the MIF staff team to the guests. The government needed both timely and accurate information. Reports were written twice daily, and databases on incidents of note were kept up to date as they occurred. The MIF manager ensured Dr. Bloomfield received the best information for the daily briefing to keep New Zealand public informed. The staff in a MIF was hundreds of people in siloed organisations. It was important to focus them as one team. The MIF manager needed collaborative relationships with the head of each area, but also required a stand-up meeting daily where anyone had a voice. The most influential stakeholders were the guests. Due to the need for guests to isolate, it was hard to engage. Most information was delivered to rooms in pamphlet drops or on their television screens. The best way to engage remained face-to-face and fell mainly to the nurses doing health checks. A MIF manager needed to be engaged with their nurses to ensure good feedback. The team could then adapt to a more supportive environment for each guest group. The best way to reassure guests was to set the tone at the start. As guests arrive, a brief was delivered to assure them that the team was there to help. Deepak will now cover the last point.
Hi, it's me Deepak. Here we are going to discuss about monitoring stakeholder engagement. This phase is the feedback stage of stakeholder management process. The main objective of this stage is to tailor strategies to engage stakeholders through adjusting and modifying plans that were made in the initial phases of stakeholder management process. It is essential to monitor stakeholders throughout the project and tailor the stakeholder engagement plan accordingly, since the project environment changes constantly and you don't want to lose the support of key stakeholders, do you? The first step is to observe how stakeholders react to your engagement strategies. In the second step, you have to update the documents according to the observations that you have made. In the final step, you have to adjust, modify, or create new engagement plans and execute them accordingly. Here are few tools that may help you to perform this stage. Over to you, Mohan.
So, what have you learned until now? Stakeholder management is done in 4 stages. The first stage is to identify stakeholders. The second stage is to plan your stakeholder engagement. The third stage is to manage stakeholder engagement. This is where you would actually execute your stakeholder engagement plan. The last stage is monitoring stakeholder engagement. Okay, your job now is to apply stakeholder engagement techniques to your projects and let us know how you do. Remember, the key to make all the stakeholders happy is to communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate.